Chapter 11. The Green Palace. We approached the Green Palace at about noon. It was deserted and falling into ruin. Only ragged pieces of glass remained in its windows, and great sheets of the green facing had fallen away from the metal framework. Looking northeastward before I entered it, I was surprised to see a large bay or inlet where I judged Wandsworth and Battersea must once have been. I thought then, though I never followed up the thought, of what might have happened, or might be happening, to the living things in the sea. Along the face of the palace I saw writing in some unknown letters. I thought, rather foolishly, that Vina might help me to read this. But I learned that the idea of reading had never entered her head. She always seemed to me, I fancy, more human than she was, perhaps because her affection was so human. The door was open and broken. Inside, we found a long wide room lit by many side windows. At the first glance, I was reminded of a museum. The floor was thick with dust, and a curious collection of various objects was covered with dust as with a garment. Then I saw, standing up in the center of the hall, what was clearly the lower part of a huge skeleton. I saw that it was a megatherium. The head and upper bones lay beside it in the thick dust, and in one place where rainwater had dropped through a hole in the roof, the thing itself had been worn away. Further in the gallery was the huge skeleton of a brontosaurus. My idea that this was a museum was shown to be correct. Going towards the side, I found what appeared to be sloping shelves. I cleared away the thick dust and found the old familiar glass cases of our own time. But they must have been airtight, to judge from the fair preservation of some of their contents. Clearly, we stood among the ruins of some latter-day South Kensington. We were in the part of which dealt with the early history of ancient life upon the earth. Here and there I found things from the cases broken to pieces and threaded on strings, a sign that the little people had been playing here. Some of the cases had been taken away, by the Morlocks as I judged. The place was very silent. The thick dust deadened our footsteps. Vina very quietly took my hand as I gazed about me and stood beside me. To judge from the size of the place, this green palace had a great deal more in it than this one hall. Possibly historical rooms, it might be even a library. To me, at least in my present circumstances, these would be vastly more interesting than ancient bones. I found a short passage running across. This appeared to be devoted to minerals, and the sight of a block of sulfur set my mind running on gunpowder. But I could find no saltpetre. Yet the sulfur hung in my mind, and set up a train of thinking. I am no specialist in mineralogy, and I went on down a ruined hole running parallel to the first hole. This second hole had been given to natural history, plants, birds, animals, etc. But everything had long since passed out of recognition. A few dried and blackened remains of what had once been animals, a brown dust of departed plants. That was all. Then we came to a hole of gigantic size, but ill-lit. The floor ran downward at a slight angle from the end at which I entered. White glass lamps hung from the ceiling, many of them cracked and broken. Rising on either side of me were huge machines, all very rusty and many broken down, but some still fairly complete. You know, I have a certain weakness for machines, and I wanted to stay among these. I could make only the wildest guesses at what they were for. I fancy that if I could find the answer to their puzzles, I should find myself in possession of powers that might be of use against the Morlocks. Suddenly, Vina came very close to my side, so suddenly that she startled me. Had it not been for her, I do not think I should have noticed that the floor of the hole sloped at all. The end I had come in at was quite above ground, and was lit by narrow windows. As you went down the length, the ground came up against these windows, until at last there was a pit in front of each window, and only a narrow line of daylight at the top. I went slowly along, puzzling about the machines. I had been too interested in them to notice the gradual lessening of the light, until Vina's increasing fears drew my attention. Then I saw that the hole ran down at last into thick darkness. I looked around me. I saw that the dust was less thick and its surface less even, farther away towards the dimness. It appeared to be broken by a number of small, narrow footprints. My feeling of the presence of the Morlocks came back to me. I felt that I was wasting my time in this examination of machinery. I called to mind that it was already far advanced in the afternoon, and that I had still no weapon, and no safe hiding place, and no means of making a fire. And then, in the remote blackness of the hole, I heard a peculiar pattering, the same odd noise I had heard down the well. I took Vina's hand, then struck with a sudden idea, I left her. I turned to a machine nearby. A long bar stood out from it. I climbed up on the stand and seized the bar in my hands. I put all my weight upon it sideways. Suddenly, Vina, deserted in the central passage, began to cry. I had judged the strength of the bar correctly, for it broke after a minute's effort, and I went back to her with a weapon in my hand, good enough, I judged, for any Morlock's head, and I wanted very much to kill a Morlock. Well, weapon in one hand and Vina in the other, I went out of the hole and into another still larger one. At the first sight it reminded me of an army church hung with flags. I recognized the brown rags that hung from the sides of it. They were the decaying remains of books which had long since dropped to pieces. If I had been a writer, I might perhaps have thought upon the uselessness of all hope for fame. But as it was, the thing that struck me was the enormous waste of labor to which this mass of rotting paper bore witness. Then, going up a broad staircase, we came to what may once have been a hall of chemistry, and here I had much hope of useful discoveries. Except at one end, where the roof had fallen in, this hall was well preserved. I went eagerly to every unbroken case, and at last, in one of the really airtight cases, I found a box of matches. Very eagerly I tried them. They were perfectly good. They were not even damp. I turned to Vina. "Dance!" I cried to her in her own tongue. For now I had a weapon indeed against the horrible creatures we feared. And so, in that old deserted museum, upon the thick, soft carpeting of dust, to Vina's huge delight, I solemnly performed a kind of dance, whistling the tune as cheerfully as I could. It was very strange, and very fortunate for me that this box of matches had escaped the wear of time for so many years. Yet, oddly enough, I found a far unlikelier substance, and that was camphor. I found it in a steel jar. I fancied at first that it was candle wax. I broke the glass. The smell of camphor was unmistakable. I was about to throw it away, but I remembered that camphor burns with a good bright flame. It is, in fact, an excellent candle. So I put it in my pocket. I found no explosives, nor any means of breaking down the bronze doors. As yet, my iron bar was the most helpful thing I had chanced upon. I left that whole feeling much happier. I cannot tell you all the story of that long afternoon. I remember a long hall of rusting stands of arms, and how I wondered whether to keep my bar or take an axe or a sword. I could not carry both. My bar of iron promised to be most useful against the bronze doors. There were numbers of guns, pistols, and rifles. Most of them were masses of rust, but many were of some new metal and still very good. But any shots of or gunpowder and had rotted into dust. One corner I saw was burnt and partly destroyed. Perhaps, I thought, by an explosion among these things. As the evening drew on, my interest became less. I went through hall after hall, dusty, silent, often ruinous. In one place I suddenly found myself near the model of a tin mine, and then by the merest accident I discovered, in an airtight case, 2 packets of dynamite. I shouted, "At last!" and broke the case with joy. And then came a doubt. Then going into a little side room I made my experiments. I never felt such a disappointment as I did in waiting 5, 10, 15 minutes for an explosion that never came. Of course, the things were not really dynamite. I might have guessed it. I really believe that had they been dynamite, I would have rushed off and blown the bronze doors of the Sphinx, and, as it proved, blown up my chances of finding the time machine. At last we came to a little open court within the palace. It was grassy and had 3 fruit trees. So we rested and refreshed ourselves. Towards sunset I began to consider our position. Night was creeping upon us, and my safe hiding place had still to be found. But that troubled me very little now. I had in my possession a thing that was, perhaps, the best of all defenses against the Morlocks. I had matches. I had the camphor in my pocket too, if a blaze were needed. It seemed to me that the best thing we could do would be to pass the night in the open, protected by a fire. In the morning there was the task of getting the time machine. Towards that, as yet, I had only my iron bar. But now, with my growing knowledge, I felt very differently towards those bronze doors. Up to this time, I had not forced them, largely because of the mystery on the other side. They had never seemed to me very thick, and I hope to find my bar of iron strong enough for the work. Chapter 12. Battle with Morlocks. We came out of the palace while the sun was still above the horizon. I was determined to reach the White Sphinx early the next morning. I meant to push through the woods that had stopped me on our first journey before sunset, then to go as far as possible during that night, and then build a fire and sleep in the protection of its light. So as we went along, I gathered sticks and dried grass. Soon I had my arms full of such stuff. Thus loaded, my progress was slower than I had expected, and Vina was tired. And I began to suffer from sleepiness too. So that it was night before we reached the wood. Upon the edge of the wood, Vina would have stopped, fearing the darkness before us. But a feeling of danger that should have indeed served me as a warning drove me onward. I had been without sleep for a night and 2 days. I felt sleep coming upon me, and the Morlocks with it. While we waited, I saw 3 dim figures among the bushes behind us. There was long grass all about us, and I did not feel safe from their hidden approach. The forest was rather less than a mile across. If we could get through it to the bare hillside, there, as it seemed to me, was a far safer resting place. I thought that with my matches and my camphor, I could keep my path well lit through the woods. Yet it was clear that if I was to hold matches with my hands, I would have to drop my firewood. So, rather unwillingly, I put it down. Then it came into my head that I would amaze our friends behind by lighting the firewood. I was to discover the foolishness of this action, but it came to my mind as a clever move for covering our retreat. I don't know if you ever thought that what a rare thing flame must be in the absence of men and in a cool country. The sun's heat is never strong enough to burn. Lightning might blacken, but it really gives rise to widespread fire. Decaying plants might sometimes become heated, but this rarely results in flame. In this world of little people, the art of fire-making had been forgotten. The red tongues that went licking up my heap of food were an altogether new and strange thing to Weena. She wanted to run to it and play with it. I believe she would have cast herself into it had I not held her. But I carved her up, and in spite of her struggles, ran boldly into the wood. For a little way the light of my fire lit the path. Looking back, I could see, through the crowded stems, that from my heap of sticks, the blaze had spread to some bushes nearby, and a curved line of fire was creeping up the grass of the hill. I laughed at that and turned again to the dark trees before me. It was very black, and Weena had held tightly to me. It was very black, but there was still, as my eyes grew accustomed to the darkness, sufficient light for me to see my way. Overhead there was black darkness, except where a gap of distant blue sky shone down upon us here and there. I struck none of my matches because I had no hand free. Upon my left arm I carried little Weena. In my right hand I had my iron bar. For some way I heard nothing but the cracking sticks under my feet, the faint whisper of the wind above, and my own breathing and the beat of the blood vessels in my ears. Then I seemed to know of a pattering about me. I pushed on. The pattering grew more distinct, and then I caught the same queer sounds and voices I had heard in the underworld. There were several of the Morlocks, and they were closing in upon me. Indeed, in another minute, I felt a pull at my coat. Then something pulled my arm. Weena trembled and became quite still. The Morlocks were closing in upon me. It was time for a match. But to get one I must put Weena down. I did so, and as I put my hand in my pocket, a struggle began in the darkness about my knees, perfectly silent on her part and with the same peculiar cooing sounds from the Morlocks. Soft little hands, too, were creeping over my coat and back, touching even my neck. Then the match scratched and fizzed. I held it up and saw the white bags of the Morlocks in flight amid the trees. I hastily took a lump of camphor from my pocket and prepared to light it as soon as the match went out. Then I looked at Weena. She was lying quite motionless on the ground. With a sudden fright I stooped to her. She seemed scarcely to breathe. I lit the block of camphor and threw it to the ground. It slipped and burned up brightly, and drove back the Morlocks and the shadows. Then I knelt down and lifted her. The wood behind seemed full of the stir and murmur of a great company. she seemed to have fainted. I put her carefully upon my shoulder and rose to push on, and then there came a horrible realization. In getting out my matches and camphor, I had turned myself about several times, and now I had not the faintest idea in what direction lay my path. I had lost my way. For all I knew, I might be facing back towards the Green Palace. I felt fear come upon me. I had to think rapidly what to do. I determined to build a fire and encamp where we were. I put Fina, still motionless, down upon the grass. Very hastily, as my first lump of camphor went out, I began collecting sticks and leaves. Here and there, out of the darkness around me, the Morlocks' eyes shone like jewels. The camphor burned for a time, then went out. I lit a match, and as I did so, two white forms that had been approaching Weena dashed hastily away. One was so blinded by the light that he came straight for me, and I felt his bones crush under the blow of my fist. He gave a cry of pain, went back a little way, and fell down. I lit another piece of camphor, and went on gathering my fire. Soon I noticed how dried some of the leaves above me were. Since my arrival on the time machine, about a week ago, no rain had fallen. So, instead of looking about among the trees for fallen sticks, I began jumping up and pulling down branches. Very soon I had a smoky fire of green wood and dry sticks, and I could use less of my camphor. I turned to where Levina lay beside my iron bar. I had tried what I could to help her, but she lay like one dead. I could not even satisfy myself whether or not she breathed. Now the smoke of the fire beat over towards me, and it must have made me heavy with sleep. Moreover, the smell of camphor was in the air. My fire would not need more wood for an hour or so. I felt very tired after my efforts and sat down. The forest, too, was full of a sleepy murmur that I did not understand. I seemed just to nod and open my eyes, but all was dark, and the Morlocks had their hands upon me. Throwing off their cold fingers, I hastily felt in my pocket for the matchbox, and it had gone! Then they seized me and closed with me again. In the moment I knew what had happened. I had slept, and my fire had gone out. The bitterness of death came over my soul. The forest seemed full of the smell of burning wood. I was caught by the neck, by the hair, by the arms, and pulled down. It was horrible in the darkness to feel all these soft creatures heaped upon me. I felt as if I was in this spider's web. I was overpowered and went down. I felt little teeth biting at my neck. I rolled over, and as I did so, my hand came against my iron lever. It gave me strength. I struggled up, shaking the human rats from me, and, holding the bar short, I thrust where I judged their faces might be. I could feel the giving of flesh and bone under my blows, and for a moment I was free. The strange joy that so often seems to accompany hard fighting came upon me. I knew that both I and Weena were lost, but I determined to make the Morlocks pay for their meat. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of their cries. A minute passed, their voices seemed to rise to a higher note of excitement, and their movements grew faster, yet none came within reach. I stood gazing at the blackness. Then suddenly came hope. What if the Morlocks were afraid? Then a strange thing happened. The darkness seemed to shine. Very dimly I began to see the Morlocks about me, three broken at my feet, and then I saw that the others were running in an unending stream. as it seemed from behind me and away through the wood in front, and their backs seemed no longer white but reddish. As I stood gazing, I saw a little red spark fly across between the branches and disappear. Then I understood the smell of burning wood, the murmur that was growing now into a roar, the red glow, and the Morlocks' flight. Stepping out from behind my tree and looking back, I saw through the black pillars of the nearer trees the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire coming after me. I looked for Vina, but she was gone. The hissing and cracking behind me, the explosive thud as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for thought. My iron bar still in my hand, I followed in the Morlocks' path. It was a close race. Once the flames crept forward so swiftly on my right as I ran that I was cut off and had to go to the left. But at last I came out upon a small open space. As I did so, a Morlock came rushing towards me, and past me, and went on straight into the fire. Now I was to see the most horrible thing of all. The whole space was as bright as day with the reflection of the fire. In the center was a little hill. Beyond this was another arm of the burning forest, with yellow tongues already coming from it, completely encircling the space with a fence of fire. Upon the hillside were some 30 or 40 Morlocks, blinded by the light and heat, and running to and fro against each other in their fear. At first I did not realize their blindness and struck furiously at them with my bar as they approached me, killing one and wounding several more. But when I had watched one of them against the red sky, feeling his way about and heard their cries, I was sure of their absolute helplessness and misery, and I struck no more of them. Yet, every now and then one came straight towards me, filling me with a momentary horror. At one time the flames died down, and I feared the disgusting creatures would be able to see me. And I was even thinking of beginning the fight by killing some of them before this might happen. But the fire burst out again brightly, and I held my hand. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Vina, but Vina was gone. At last I sat down on top of the hill and watched this strange, unbelievable company of blind things feeling their way to and fro and making queer noises to each other. As the red lights of the fire beat on them, 2 or 3 Morlocks ran into me, and I drove them off with fierce blows, trembling as I did so. For the greater part of the night, I was persuaded it was all a bad dream. I bit myself and screamed in my desire to awake. I beat the ground with my hands and got up and sat down again, and wandered here and there and again sat down. Then I began rubbing my eyes and calling upon God to let me wake up. 3 times I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a mad despair and rush into the flames. But at last, above the dying red of the fire, above the streaming masses of black smoke, and the decreasing numbers of these deemed creatures, came the white light of the day. I searched again for traces of Vina, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. I cannot describe how relieved I was to think that it had escaped an awful end for which it seemed to be intended. As I thought of that, I was almost moved to begin killing the helpless Morlocks about me. But I controlled myself. The hill was a kind of island in the forest. From its top I could now see the green palace through the smoke. And from that I could get my direction for the white sphinx. I tied some grass about my feet and went on across smoking ashes and among black stems towards the hiding place of the time machine. I walked slowly, for my strength was going and my feet were sore, and I felt miserable at the horrible death of little Vina. Now, in this old familiar room, It is more like the sorrow of a dream than an actual loss. But that morning, it left me absolutely lonely again. Terribly alone. I began to think of this house of mine, of this fireside of some of you, and almost wept with desire to be home again. But as I walked toward smoking ashes under the bright morning sky, I made a discovery. In my pocket were still some loose matches. The box must have leaked before it was lost. Chapter 13. Recovery of the Time Machine. About 8 or 9 in the morning, I came to the same seat made of yellow metal from which I had looked at the world upon the evening of my arrival. I thought of my hasty ideas upon that evening and laughed bitterly at my confidence. Here was the same beautiful scene, the same trees, the same splendid palaces and noble ruins, the same still river running between its green banks. The little people in their bright garments were moving to and fro among the trees. Some were bathing in exactly the place where I had saved Vina, and that suddenly gave me a keen sense of pain. And like ugly swellings rose the domes above the ways of the underworld. I understand now what all the beauty of the underworld people covered. Very pleasant was their day, as pleasant as the days of the cattle in the field. Like the cattle, they knew of no enemies and provided against no needs, and their end was the same. I grieved to think how brief the dream of the human intellect had been. It set itself towards comfort and ease, a society with safety and security as its aim. I realized its hopes, and it come to this at last. At one time, life and wealth must have reached almost absolute safety. The rich felt sure of his riches and comfort. The worker was sure of his life and work. No doubt, in that perfect world there was no problem of unemployment, no social question left unanswered, and a great quiet had followed. We tend to forget a love of nature. Change, danger, and trouble seem to us to be evils which we must avoid. But change, danger, and trouble are the things which keep the intellect alive and keen. An animal perfectly suited to its surroundings and living in perfect unity with them is a perfect machine. It has no need to think. Thought and intelligence are needed only when things go wrong. When there is change, danger, trouble, that is when intelligence is demanded. Only those animals have intelligence which have to meet a great variety of needs and dangers. So the upper-world man became feeble and pretty, and the underworld man became a mechanical laborer. But this could not last. As time went on, the feeding system of the underworld broke down. When other meat failed, they turned to the food which custom and law had, until then, forbidden. That is how things seem to me in the year 800-2701. After the efforts, excitement, and terrors of the past days, and in spite of my grief, this seat and the peaceful view and the warm sunlight were very pleasant. I was very tired. Spreading myself out upon the grass, I had a long and refreshing sleep. I awoke a little before sunset. I now felt safe against being caught by the Morlocks. I stood up and came on down the hill towards the White Sphinx. I had my bar in one hand and the other plate with the matches in my pocket. And now came a most unexpected thing. As I approached the base of the Sphinx, I found the bronze doors were open. I stopped short before them, afraid for a moment to enter. Inside there was a small room. And on a raised place in the corner of this was the time machine. I had the starting handles in my pocket, so here, after all my careful plans for attack, they had suddenly surrendered. I threw my iron bar away, almost sorry not to use it. A sudden thought came into my head as I bent down towards the doorway. For once, at least, I understood the Morlock's way of thinking. I felt inclined to laugh, but did not. I stepped through the bronze frame and up to the time machine. I was surprised to find it had been carefully oiled and cleaned. I suspect that the Morlocks had even partly taken it to pieces while trying in their dim way to understand its purpose. I stood and examined it, finding a pleasure in the mere touch of the machine. Then the thing I had expected happened. The bronze door suddenly slid up and struck the frame with a clank. I was in the dark, trapped. So the Morlocks thought. I could already hear their murmuring laughter as they came towards me. Very calmly I tried to strike the match. I had only to fix on the handles and depart like a ghost. But I had forgotten one little thing. The matches were of that kind that light only on the box. You may imagine how all my calm left me. The little creatures were close upon me. One touched me. I made a sweeping blow in the dark at them and began to climb hastily into the seat of the machine. Then came one hand upon me and then another. Then I had to fight against them for my handles, and at the same time feel for the bars over which the handles fitted. They almost got one handle away from me. As it slipped from my hand, I had to thrust into darkness to get it. It was a nearer thing than the fight in the forest. At last the handle was fixed and moved over. The Morlocks' hand slipped from me. The darkness fell from my eyes. I found myself in the same grey light and confusion which I had already described. Chapter 14. Journey forward into time. I have already told you of the sickness and confusion that comes with time traveling. And this time I was not seated properly on the machine, but sideways in an unsteady way. For some time I held on to the machine as it swung and shook, not caring how I went. I looked at the dials, the clock faces. One dial records days, another thousands of days, another millions of days, and another thousands of millions. When I looked at the dials, I found that the hand which showed thousands of days was sweeping round as fast as the seconds hand of a watch into the future. As I drove on, a peculiar change came in the appearance of things. The grayness grew darker, then rapid change, bright, dark, showing day and night, returned. When I was traveling fast, the bright, dark change became one grayness. It was seen only at lower speeds. But now I was traveling fast, and yet I could see it. This puzzled me very much at first. The change of night and day grew slower and slower, and so did the passage of the sun across the sky, until they seemed to stretch through centuries. At last a steady half-life spread over the earth, a dimness only broken now and then when a comet flashed across the sky. The band of light which had shown the sun had long since disappeared, for the sun had ceased to set. It simply rose and fell in the west and grew even broader and more red. All trace of the moon had disappeared. At last, some time before I stopped, the sun, red and very large, stayed motionless upon the horizon, a vast circle glowing with a dull heat. I saw, by the slowing down of its rising and setting, that the earth had come to rest with one face to the sun, even as in our time the moon faces the earth. Very carefully I began to change my position. Slower and slower went the circling hands until the thousandth hand seemed motionless, and the daily hand was no longer a mere mist upon its dial. Still slower until the dim outlines of a deserted seashore grew visible. I stopped very gently and sat upon the time machine, looking round. The sky was no longer blue. Northeastward it was inky black, and out of the blackness shone brightly and steadily the pale white stars. Overhead it was a deep Indian red and starless, and southeastward it grew brighter to a glowing red, with the huge sun lay red and motionless. The rocks about me were of a reddish color, and the only trace of life which I could see was the green which covered every outstanding point on the southeastern face of the rocks. It was the same rich green which one sees on forest moss or in plants which grow in a dim light. The machine was standing on a sloping shore. The sea stretched away to the southwest. There were no waves. There was not a breath of wind. There was only a slight oily rise and fall like a gentle breathing, which showed that the sea was still moving and living. And along the edge where the water sometimes broke was a thick covering of salt, pink under this red sky. There was an uncomfortable feeling in my head, and I noticed that I was breathing very fast. The feeling reminded me of my own experience of mountain climbing, and from that I judged the air to be thinner, less dense than it is now. Far away up the slope I heard a scream, and saw a thing like a huge white moth go circling up into the sky and disappear over some low hills beyond. The sound of its voice was so distressing that I trembled and seated myself more firmly upon the machine. Looking around me again, I saw that, quite near, what I had taken to be a reddish mass of rock was moving slowly towards me, and I saw that the thing was really a gigantic crab-like creature. Can you imagine a crab as large as the table, with its many legs moving slowly and uncertainly? Its big claws swaying, its long feelers, like caught whips, waving and feeling, and its eyes shining at you on either side of its metallic front? Its back was rough and ornamented with round, outstanding masses, and a greenish rust marked it here and there. I could see its complicated mouth moving as it advanced. As I gazed at this fearful creature coming towards me, I felt a touch on my cheek as though a fly had settled there. I tried to brush it away with my hand, but in a moment it returned, and almost immediately came another by my ear. I struck at this, and coughed something thread-like. It was drawn swiftly out of my hand. I turned, and saw that I had seized the failure of another great crab which stood just behind me. Its evil eyes were moving on their long stems. Its mouth was all alive with hunger, and its vast, ugly claws were descending upon me. In a moment my hand was on the starter, and I had placed a mount between myself and these creatures. But I was still on the same beach, and I saw them distantly now as soon as I stopped. They seemed to be creeping here and there, in the dim light among the sheets of green. I cannot describe the dead emptiness of that world. The red eastern sky, the northward blackness, the salt Dead Sea, the stony shore with these horrible, slow-moving creatures, the poisonous-looking green of the mossy plants, the thin air and pain of breathing, all added to the terrible effect. I moved on 100 years, and there was the same red sun, the same dying sea, the same cold air, and the same crowd of crabs creeping in and out among the green wheat and the red rocks. And in the westward sky I saw a curled pale line like a vast new moon. So I travelled, stopping ever and again, in great steps of 1,000 years or more, drawn on by the mystery of the earth's fate, watching with a strange wonder the sun grow larger and duller in the westward sky, and the life of the old earth die away. At last, more than 30 million years on from now, the huge red-hot dome of the sun had covered nearly a tenth part of the darkening heavens. Then I stopped once more. The crabs had disappeared, and the red beach, save for its green mosses, seemed lifeless. Now it was touched with white. It was bitterly cold. To the northeastward, the whiteness of snow lay under the starlight of the black sky, and I could see the tops of hills pinkish white. And there were lines of ice along the sea edge, with masses farther out, but the main extent of the salt ocean, all bloody under the unending sunset, was still unfrozen. I looked about me to see if any traces of animal life remained. A certain fear still kept me in the seat of the machine, but I saw nothing moving, in earth or sky or sea. The green on the rocks alone showed that any life remained. A sandbank had appeared in the sea, and the water had gone back from the beach. I fancied I saw some black object upon this bank, but it became motionless as I looked at it, and I judged that my eye had been deceived, and that the black object was merely a rock. The stars in the sky were very bright and shone with a steady, unchanging light. Suddenly I noticed that the circular westward outline of the sun had changed, that a bay had appeared in the curve. I saw this grow larger. For a minute, perhaps, I gazed at this blackness that was creeping over the day, and then I realized that an eclipse was beginning. Either the moon or the planet Mercury was passing across the sun's face. Naturally, at first I took it to be the moon, but I now believe that what I really saw was an inner planet passing very near to the Earth. The darkness grew. A cold wind began to blow from the east, and the snow fell faster. From the edge of the sea came a quiet whisper. Beyond these lifeless sounds, the world was silent. Silent? It would be hard to describe the stillness of it. All the sounds of men, the voices of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. As the darkness thickened, the snow fell yet more heavily, and the cold of the air was more biting. At last, one by one, swiftly, one after the other, the white tops of the distant hills were lost into blackness. I saw the black central shadow of the eclipse sweeping towards me. In another moment, the pale stars alone were visible. The sky was absolutely black. A horror of this great darkness came on me. The cold that struck to my bones, and the pain I felt in breathing overcame me. A deadly sickness came upon me. Then, like a red-hot bow in the sky, appeared the edge of the sun. I got off the machine to recover myself. I felt weak and unable to face the return journey. As I stood sick and confused, I saw again the moving thing upon the sandbank. There was no mistake now that it was a moving thing. Against the red water of the sea, it was a round thing, the size of a football perhaps. Or it may be bigger, and feelers hung down from it. It seemed black against the blood-red water. Then I felt that I was fainting, but a terrible dread of lying helpless in that distant and awful dimness gave me strength, while I climbed upon the seat of the machine. Chapter 15. Return of the Time Traveler. So I came back. For a long time I must have lain senseless upon the machine. The change of day and night began again. The sun became golden again, the sky blue. I breathed with greater freedom. The hands spun backward upon the dials. At last I saw again the dim shadows of houses, the signs of men in decay. These too changed and passed, and others came. Soon, when the million dial was at 0, I lessened the speed. I began to recognize our own little buildings. The thousands had ran back to the starting point. The night and day changed more slowly. The old walls of the laboratory came round me. Very gently now I slowed the machine down. I saw one little thing that seemed odd to me. I think I have told you that when I set out, before my speed became very high, Mistress Watchett had walked across the room, traveling, as it seemed to me, like a shot from a gun. As I returned, I passed again across that minute, and she crossed the laboratory. But now her motion appeared to be the exact opposite of her earlier ones. The door at the lower end opened, and she moved quietly up the laboratory. going backwards, and disappeared behind the door by which she had come in. Then I stopped the machine, and saw about me again the old familiar laboratory, my tools just as I had left them. I got off the machine weakly and sat down upon my chair. For several minutes I trembled, then I became calmer. Around me was my old workshop again, exactly as it had been. I might have slept there, the whole thing had been a dream. And yet not exactly. The machine had started from the southeast corner of the laboratory. It had come to the rest again in the northwest, against the wall where you saw it. That gives you the exact distance from my little lawn to the base of this white sphinx, into which the Morlocks had carried it. For a time I could not think. Then I got up and came through the passage here, walking painfully because my foot was still sore. I saw the newspaper on the table by the door. I found the date was indeed today, and looking at the clock, saw the hour was almost 8 o'clock. I heard your voices and the clatter of plates. I stood there for a moment. I felt so sick and weak. Then I smelled good meat, and opened the door on you. You know the rest. I washed and dined, and I am telling you the story. I know, he said, after a pause, that all this will be absolutely unbelievable. To me, the one unbelievable thing is that I am here tonight, in this old familiar room, looking into your friendly faces and telling you these strange adventures. He looked at the medical man. No, I cannot expect you to believe it. Take it as a lie. Say I dreamed it in the workshop. Consider I have been thinking about the future fate of our race until I have imagined this story. Treat my statement that it is true as a mere trick to increase its interest, and take it as a story. What do you think of it? He took up his pipe and began, in his old accustomed manner, to tap with it upon the bars of the fireplace. There was a momentary stillness. Then chairs began to move. I took my eyes off the time traveler's face and looked around at his audience. The medical man gazed steadily at our host. The editor was looking hard at the end of his cigar. The sixth. The newspaper writer felt for his watch. The editor stood up with a sigh. What a pity it is you're not a writer of stories, he said, putting his hand on the time traveler's shoulder. You don't believe it? Well, I thought not. The time traveler turned to us. Where are the matches? He said. He lit one and spoke over his pipe. To tell you the truth, I hardly believed myself, and yet his eye fell upon the dead white flowers upon the little table. Then he turned over the hand holding his pipe, and I saw he was looking at some half-healed cuts on his fingers. The medical man rose, came to the lamp, and examined the flowers. They are very odd, he said. The psychologist leaned forward to see, holding out his hand for one to look at. It is 1:15, said the journalist. How shall we get home? It's a curious thing, said the medical man. But I certainly don't know what sort of flowers they are. I have never seen anything like them. May I have them? The time traveler paused. Then suddenly, certainly not. Where did you really get them? Said the medical man. The time traveler put his hand to his head. He spoke like one who was trying to keep hold of an idea that escaped him. They were put into my pocket by Vina when I traveled into time. He looked around the room. It's all going. This room and you and the feeling of everyday life is too much for my memory. Did I ever make it a time machine or a model of a time machine? Or is it only a dream? They say life is a dream, a very poor dream at times. Where did the dream come from? I must look at that machine, if there is one. He caught off the lamp swiftly and carried it through the door into the corridor. We followed him. There in the light of the lamp was the machine. Sure enough, It was solid to the touch, for I put out my hand and felt it. It had bits of grass and moss upon the lower parts, and one bar bent out of shape. The time traveler put the lamp down on the table and ran his hand along the damaged bar. "It's all right now," he said. "The story I told you was true. I'm sorry to have brought you out here in the cold." He took up the lamp and, in an absolute silence, we returned to the smoking room. He came into the hall with us and helped the editor on with his coat. The medical man looked into his face and, with a certain doubt, told him he was suffering from overwork, at which he laughed. I remember him standing in the open doorway, shouting good night. I shared a carriage with the editor. He thought the tale a splendid lie. I was unable to come to a decision. The story was so strange and unbelievable, the telling so quiet and reasonable. I lay awake most of the night thinking about this strange story. I decided to go next day and see the time traveler again. I was told that he was in the laboratory. Being a friend, I went straight in, but the laboratory was empty. I looked for a minute at the time machine and put out my hand and touched the handle. At that, the heavy-looking mass swung like a branch shaken by the wind. I came back through the passage. The time traveler met me in the smoking room. He was coming from the house. He had a small camera under one arm and a bag under the other. He laughed when he saw me. "I'm frightfully busy," said he, "with that thing in there." "But isn't it some trick?" I said. "Do you really travel through time?" "Really and truly I do." And he looked into my eyes. Then his eye wandered about the room. "I only want half an hour," he said. "I know why you came, and it's very good of you. There are some newspapers here. If you'll stop to lunch, I'll prove that this time traveling is real. Will you forgive my leaving you now?" I agreed, hardly understanding then the full meaning of his words. He went on down the passage. I heard the door of the laboratory shut, seated myself in a chair, and took up a daily paper. What was he going to do before lunchtime? Then suddenly I was reminded by an advertisement that I had promised to meet Richardson, the publisher, at 2. I looked at my watch and saw that I could hardly get there in time. I got up and went down the passage to tell the time traveler that I must hurry away. As I took hold of the handle of the door of the laboratory, I heard a cry suddenly cut short, and a click and a thud. A rush of air swept round me as I opened the door, and from within came the sound of broken glass falling on the floor. The time traveler was not there. I seemed to see a ghostly figure sitting in a swinging mass of black and brass for a moment. A figure so transparent that the table behind with its sheets of drawings was absolutely distinct. But this ghost disappeared as I rubbed my eyes. The time machine had gone, save for a settling cloud of dust. The further end of the laboratory was empty. A sheet of glass in the window had just been blown in. I felt an unreasonable amazement. I knew that something strange had happened, and for the moment could not think what the strange thing might be. As I stood there, the door into the garden opened, and the man servant appeared. We looked at each other. Then ideas began to come. "Has Mr. gone out that way?" said I. "No, sir. No one has come out this way. I was expecting to find him here." At that I understood. At the risk of disappointing Richardson, I stayed on, waiting for the time traveler, waiting for the second, perhaps still stranger story, and the photographs he would bring with him. But I am beginning now to fear that I must wait a lifetime. The time traveler disappeared 3 years ago, and as everybody knows now, he has never returned. I cannot help wondering, will he ever return? It may be that he swept back into the past and fell among the blood-drinking, hairy wild men of the age of unpolished stone, or among the gigantic lizards of the distant past. Or did he go forward into one of the nearer ages, in which men are still men, but with the questions of our own time answered? Has he gone into the manhood of the race? I say manhood of the race because I cannot think that these days of weak experiment, imperfect knowledge, and angry discussion are indeed the highest point of man's history. He, I know, had little hope of the advancement of mankind. He saw in the growing pile of civilization only a foolish heaping that must, in the end, fall back upon its makers and destroy them. If that is so, it remains for us to live as though it were not so. But to me, the future is still black and unknown. It is a vast ignorance, lit at a few places by the memory of a story, and I have by me, for my comfort, two strange white flowers, brown and flat and dry, to witness that, even when mind and strength had gone, gratitude and tender love for one another still lived on in the heart of man.